Great Lakes are incredibly important to the planet. From the Great Lakes of North America to Lake Victoria in Africa and Lake Baikal in Asia, these massive water bodies provide crucial fresh water for people, plants, and of course animals. But one continent, Australia, doesn't actually have any Great Lakes despite appearing to have quite a few on Google Maps. So where did all of Australia's Great Lakes go? But before we can answer that question, we need to first understand why Australia is so dry in the first place. Australia is often imagined as a vast, dry land, and this is for a really good reason. It's very large and very dry in most places. Its physical geography is defined by extremes, with large portions of the continent consisting of arid and semi-arid environments. This is especially true for the central and western parts of the country, which is home to the iconic outback, a term used to describe the remote and sparsely populated interior. This region of Australia is harsh, very dry, and really big. Precipitation is rare, and venturing out into it unprepared is basically signing your death warrant. All told, the outback consists of over 5.6 million square kilometers of land, fully 73% of Australia's total land area. That's an incredibly large, geographically dominant feature. And this dry interior is largely a product of Australia's topography and climate patterns. As the flattest continent overall, Australia lacks the high mountain ranges that elsewhere disrupt weather patterns and create more diverse climates. Because these topographic features don't exist in the same way they do in other parts of the world, much of Australia's interior doesn't get the process which causes rain, where moist air from the surrounding oceans is forced upward by coastal mountain ranges, causing it to cool and lose its moisture in the form of precipitation. As a result, very little rainfall makes it to the interior of the continent. The Great Dividing Range, which runs parallel to the East Coast, does create this impact a bit, but due to the westerlies largely moving weather patterns from west to east, those systems don't really come into play until well after the outback. But in truth, the lack of major mountain ranges is a relatively small factor here. It's actually Australia's location relative to global weather systems that causes such a dry environment. You see, much of Australia lies under the influence of the subtropical high-pressure belt. This is a zone of stable, descending air that suppresses cloud formation and rainfall, resulting in dry conditions. This high-pressure belt shifts slightly with the seasons, but remains a dominant feature of Australia's climate. The outback's low rainfall and high evaporation rates make it difficult for lakes and rivers to sustain themselves. Many of the rivers that do exist in the interior, such as those in the Lake Eyre Basin, are ephemeral, flowing only after very rare rain events and quickly drying up in the heat. The outback itself is a vast and varied region, stretching across multiple states and territories and encompassing deserts like the Simpson, Gibson, and Great Victoria deserts. These areas are known for their iconic red soils and sparse vegetation, and while these deserts might seem lifeless, they are home to a range of hardy plants and animal species that have adapted to the extreme conditions. The flora is dominated by tough, drought-resistant plants like spinifex and saltbush, while the fauna includes species such as kangaroos, dingoes, and reptiles that are highly adapted to surviving with minimal water. Australia's dry central regions have also been shaped by geologic factors. Over millions of years, the continent has experienced long periods of weathering and erosion. Without significant tectonic activity to rejuvenate the landscape with mountain building, the interior has become a vast, low-lying plain. The lack of young, towering mountains means there is little opportunity for snowmelt or glacial runoff to feed lakes and rivers, further contributing to the scarcity of large bodies of water. However, the aridity of Central Australia has not always been so severe. In the distant past, the region was wetter, and vast lakes once dotted the landscape. Evidence of this can be found in the salt flats and dry lake beds that remain today, such as Lake Eyre and Lake Frome. These are remnants of a time when climate was more conducive to sustaining large lakes. In other words, at one point, Australia had quite a few Great Lakes of its own, but they don't really exist anymore, which has had a profound impact on what Australia looks like today. Lakes are an incredibly important part of our world. Every inhabited continent relies on them to some extent aside from Australia. Because despite Google Maps showing many prominent large lakes in Australia, they don't really exist in the same way. Geography by Geoff is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's spooky season, which means there's no better time to tackle your fears. And I'm not talking about the ones that involve zombies or ghosts, but rather those big life fears that are holding you back. Therapy is a great way to face those fears and find ways to overcome them. And BetterHelp is here to help you do just that. BetterHelp is entirely online, which means it's very accessible, flexible, and can be adapted to your schedule. You don't need to travel to an office across town. You can do it right from where you're most comfortable, your home. When I first started considering therapy, it was scary. But after I started going, those fears went away, and I was able to start conquering other fears in my life that were holding me back. And you can do it too. So overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/aroundtheworld today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/aroundtheworld. The Great Lakes of the world are more than just vast bodies of water. They hold immense significance for every continent and country they are a part of. Across North America, Europe, South America, Asia, and Africa, these lakes have shaped where people live, the kinds of industries that have risen nearby, and the climates of the surrounding regions. Each continent's Great Lakes are vital to its identity and the lives of those who live near them. So much so that it's almost impossible to imagine any of these continents without their respective Great Lakes. North America, of course, is home to perhaps the best-known Great Lakes: Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. These lakes were created by the retreat of glaciers at the end of the last ice age and today form the largest group of freshwater lakes by area on Earth. They are vital to the economies of both the United States and Canada, supporting shipping, fishing, tourism, and agriculture. They also provide drinking water to over 40 million people. Their importance as a transportation route for goods, especially during the Industrial Revolution, cemented their role in the economic development of the region. They also moderate local climates that surround them, which would otherwise be much more extreme, though they can also bring about the dreaded lake snow effect. And not to be left out, North America, and Canada specifically, is also home to other very large prominent lakes such as Lake Winnipeg and Lake Winnipegosis, Lake Manitoba, Lake Athabasca, and Reindeer Lake, amongst many others. Over in Asia, the most significant lakes include the Caspian Sea, which is technically a lake though a salt lake, Lake Baikal, and the Aral Sea, though the latter has seen a dramatic reduction in size due to human activity. Lake Baikal in Russia is the deepest and oldest freshwater lake in the world, containing about 22% of the world's surface freshwater, more than all of North America's Great Lakes combined. Because of this, Lake Baikal is crucial for both scientific research and the local economy, especially in fishing and tourism. In Central Asia, the drying up of the Aral Sea, due to diversion of rivers for irrigation projects, stands as a stark reminder of the impact human activity can have on Great Lakes, causing ecological disasters and economic hardship for communities that once depended on the lake. Africa's Great Lakes, including Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, and Lake Malawi, are also essential to the lives of millions of people and the climate of Africa as a whole. Lake Victoria, the largest lake in Africa and the second largest freshwater lake in the world by area size, is the lifeblood of East Africa. It provides food, water, and transportation for communities in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And crucially, it is one of the largest sources of freshwater for the Nile River, creating impacts for the climate and human civilizations over thousands of years. Meanwhile, Lake Tanganyika, the second largest freshwater lake in the world by volume and the second deepest, and Lake Malawi, the fourth largest by volume, are renowned for their depths and biodiversity, supporting thriving fishing industries and unique ecosystems. These lakes are vital not only for local economies, but also for the broader environmental health of the continent, as they contribute to regulating regional climates and serve as crucial freshwater sources, sending water to many parts of Africa that are otherwise dry and arid. Over in South America, the most notable lake is Lake Titicaca, straddling the border between Peru and Bolivia. It is the highest navigable lake in the world and is steeped in the history and mythology of the indigenous people, including the Inca civilization, which considered the lake sacred. But while South America doesn't have as large or as prominent of lakes as North America, Asia, or Africa, it is home to the Amazon rainforest, which evidence suggests could have emerged as a gigantic marine lake millions of years ago before it became the wet, humid rainforest that exists on top today. If anything, South America is the perfect evidence of how Great Lakes can truly change an entire continent. Finally, Europe, while home to many lakes such as Lake Geneva, Lake Ladoga, and Lake Vänern, they are without anything nearly of the same scale as the Great Lakes of North America. But Europe is home to the Baltic Sea and Black Sea, both of which can have similar impacts on local climates and populations. These seas moderate the surrounding climates, allowing places like Helsinki, Finland, and Stockholm, Sweden to exist, and nurturing civilizations such as the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire along the Black Sea. Within this context of lakes and large bodies of water moderating climates and enabling populations to grow, Australia stands out as a notable exception. Despite its vast landmass and significant water needs, Australia lacks large, permanent lakes comparable to those found on other continents. Lakes such as Lake Eyre, Lake Torrens, and Lake Gardner appear prominent on maps, but they are actually dry salt flats, only filling with water during rare heavy rain events. This leaves Australia without the large, life-sustaining lakes that have been so important to the development and climates of other continents. So where did Australia's Great Lakes go? Australia's landscape today is often characterized by its dryness, vast deserts, and arid plains. But this wasn't always the case. In ancient times, Australia was home to a much wetter climate with expansive lakes scattered across the continent. These lakes were part of a dramatically different environment, one that supported a more diverse range of ecosystems than what is seen today. Over millions of years, however, climate change and Australia's gradual drift northward reshaped the continent, leading to the arid land that we know today. This ancient history of Great Lakes is still etched into the land, even though the lakes themselves have largely disappeared. You see, millions of years ago, during the Pleistocene epoch, Australia experienced a much cooler and wetter climate. Large inland lakes, rivers, and wetlands dotted the landscape, many of them fed by rain and glacial melt from higher elevations. The Lake Eyre Basin, which today is mostly dry, once held a vast amount of water and supported a large variety of huge animals, including large marsupials, giant birds, and reptiles. Lakes such as Lake Eyre, Lake Torrens, Lake Gardner, and Lake Frome, which today appear as large salt flats, were once filled to the brim with fresh water and served as vital habitats for this wildlife and the early human populations that lived along their shores. But as Australia's climate began to shift, becoming warmer and drier over millennia, these lakes gradually shrank and eventually dried up. The continent's slow drift northward moved it away from the cooler, wetter southern latitudes and into a more subtropical position, which is dominated by high-pressure systems that suppress rainfall. In addition, the ice ages that shaped much of the global climate change during this time caused glaciers to retreat, and the meltwater that once fed Australia's lakes dwindled. Today, Australia's climate is largely governed by its lack of water. The central and western regions, including the outback, are characterized by extreme dryness, with rainfall often being scarce and unpredictable. This shift has left Australia without large, permanent freshwater lakes. The remnants of the once Great Lakes are now seen as vast salt pans or shallow seasonal basins that only occasionally fill with water during periods of heavy rain. When rain does come, lakes like Lake Eyre can briefly return to life, creating a stunning natural spectacle as the dry salt flats become covered with water. However, this is a temporary phenomenon, and the lakes quickly return to their usual dry state. Despite their dry reality, these ancient lake beds remain prominent on modern maps, such as on Google Maps. Lakes such as Lake Eyre and Lake Torrens appear as large, impressive features, but this can be misleading. To the unknowing eye, it might seem as though Australia has large permanent lakes like those found on the other continents. In reality, these are ephemeral features that exist only intermittently, and for most of the year, there's simply no water. The reason for their prominence on maps comes from their sheer size and the striking nature of the salt flats, which are visually distinct from the surrounding landscape. These features stand out even though they do not function like traditional lakes. The salt flats of Australia are a visual reminder of the continent's wetter past. When the lakes filled with water millions of years ago, they left behind these large basins, which have since accumulated layers of salt as the water evaporated over time. This has created the shimmering white surfaces that are so easily identifiable from satellite imagery. Yet despite their appearance, these lakes do not hold water for very long, and they are far from being the life-sustaining bodies of water that lakes on other continents are. For example, Lake Eyre, which is the lowest point on the Australian continent, only fills with water every few decades, and even then, it never reaches its full capacity. But when it does fill, it becomes the largest lake in Australia, however short-lived that might be. And so that's where Australia's Great Lakes went. They dried up after Australia shifted northward, resulting in a changing climate for the region. Google Maps still shows them prominently because they are still lakes, sometimes. And as such, they are designated as lakes by the Australian government. But the reality is that Australia doesn't really have any Great Lakes, at least not nearly to the same extent as every other continent. Australia's Great Lakes disappeared over a long period of time. It is a little weird that they're still so prominently featured on the world's most used map, but technically they are designated as lakes, even if they don't really exist most of the time. This was a really fun exploration of Australia and its lack of lakes, and if you want to support my channel, be sure to check out some of these amazing maps of Australia over on my map store. I hope you enjoyed learning all about Australia's climate and lack of large lakes. If you did, please subscribe to my channel. And as usual, I'll see you next week.